words of my lips and the meditation of my heart be pleasing unto you, dear Lord. Please be seated. So what makes you zealous? Zeal is defined as eagerness, ardent interest in pursuit of something, marked by passionate support for a person, cause, or idea. So what injustices do you see that makes you zealous? Today, the gospel tells us how Jesus was consumed with zeal for God's house. When he went to the temple, he found money changers and people selling cattle, sheep, and doves, the items they required for sacrifices. Because these people were traveling so far to get to the temple for Passover, it was difficult for them to transport the animals they needed for sacrifice. So they bought them when they arrived at the temple. But first they needed to exchange their currency for the local currency, so they went to the money changers. The money changers were known to be corrupt. They were known for inflating exchange rates. The people who were selling animals were taking advantage of the common people who came to worship God. They were trying to get rich off God's temple. And Jesus decided that was not okay. That was not right, and he did something about it. He overturned the tables and drove out the merchants and the animals. One man, Jesus, knocked over the tables of the money changers and drove out the animals. Jesus was ardent that the temple, his Father's house, not be defiled by corruption. In 2014, a 15-year-old girl decided she was going to skip school. And she stood outside the Swedish parliament before an upcoming election, protesting for stronger action on climate change. After the election, she continued to skip school every Friday and continued to protest. And soon students in other communities started skipping school on Friday to protest a lack of action on climate change. And this young girl's parents did not support her activism. They did not like her missing school. And she had OCD and Asperger's syndrome. She had challenges. But her zeal was unstoppable. 4 years later, in 2018, she addressed the United Nations at their climate change conference, and students around the whole world started skipping school on Fridays to protest. She graduated high school in 2023, and her protesting escalated. She is defiant, but peaceful about her activism, and now that includes the Israel-Hamas war. And this is what BBC said about her. She is credited with raising public awareness of climate change across the world, especially amongst young people. Many commentators call this the Greta effect. And you've probably heard of her. Greta Thunberg. She was a 15-year-old girl when she caught the attention of the whole world. And she started by skipping school one day with a sign. And she never stopped because she is zealous about doing something to save this planet. And I have another story about a zealous woman. I know an unbelievably strong woman named Jane who lives in Canberra, Australia, and she's a nun. Australia's refugee policy has allowed refugees to be treated inhumanely for decades. Jane has advocated for over 20 years against Australia's corrupt refugee policy, and she continues to fight for the freedom of those refugees. She advocates for donations to assist displaced people that fled their lives from terrorist countries to Australia and were put in detention centers in Papua New Guinea or Manus Island. I've mentioned this before. Starting in 2013, Australia sent all refugees who were looking for safe haven to detention centers. And there are still people there who have been there for over 10 years. Many of them now have acute physical and mental health issues. And there's actually a TV series on Netflix called Stateless, that's based on a true story and gives you an idea about how refugees are treated in detention. It's unconscionable. And Jane is upset. And she's been upset for over 20 years. So she's been doing everything she can, and she won't stop. She and others in Australia have assisted refugees with filling out applications to come to Canada. They found translators to help over 200 refugees submit applications. And a total of 61 men have already arrived in Canada, and 30 of them have been here for over a year and are now living independently. And more will follow. Most of these men were in their late teens or early 20s when they fled their countries 10 years ago. So they have lost 10 years of their young lives in detention centers just because they wanted to find safety in another country. And Jane is now 78 years old. She is still fundraising to raise money for the people who are still stuck in Papua New Guinea with no income, families, children. But right now, Jane is sitting outside the Parliament building in Canberra. All through February and March, whenever Parliament sits, she arrives outside the Parliament building at midnight, so she's there in the morning with the donation box, asking politicians to donate to help support refugees in PNG, Papua New Guinea. She peacefully draws their attention to the fact that there are people starving on PNG because of Australia's refugee policy. And I was worried about her because she's older than I am, and I think it'd be a struggle for me to be outside all night, night after night. But she puts videos on Facebook, and she looks alive. She looks at peace. Fighting for refugees gives her life. But this is not the first time she's peacefully drawn attention to the plight of refugees. In 2014, she was one of 5 people, a group including clergy, who called themselves Love Makes a Way. And they held a prayer vigil outside an MP's office in Canberra, asking for a satisfactory answer to when 798 children and their families would be released from immigration detention. They were arrested, but released and not charged. Unfortunately, because Jane wanted to go to jail. She was willing to be detained because she wanted to draw attention to the refugees that were detained. She believes that they were released so negative attention was not drawn to that office. She says that it is important to stay present with love, to be resilient and to be hopeful, but also to be engaged. She has had refugees living in her home. She has donated money herself and initiated fundraising to help refugees get food, cell phones, clothing, and medical attention. She has advocated zealously for over 20 years. I don't consider myself a strong advocate or a protester. I'm not Greta or Jane. But there are things that come to mind when I think about what am I zealous about? Things that I see as unjust and I'm motivated to act on. When I see people treating those who are experiencing poverty or homelessness as less than themselves, I am motivated to do something. I have volunteered at a few different food banks and lunch programs over the last 10 to 15 years, where the guests are sometimes treated rudely by volunteers. But because I've gotten to know many of the guests at these places, I know that we could all be one tragedy away from being where they are. Often those experiencing homelessness or poverty are ignored or dismissed by the rest of society. But they are the same as us. But something has happened in their lives that has caused it to break down. When I volunteered with the Burnaby Homeless Society, the volunteers were told that they were to treat those guests kindly, make them feel welcome, and make them feel safe, because it might be the only time this week that they do. We treat them just like we treat all people. So I volunteer with those experiencing homelessness or poverty whenever I can. I make a point of saying hello or asking how they are when I encounter folks on the street who look like life might be hard on them. It's such a small thing I do, and it's so easy. But I wonder what God is calling you to be zealous about. All the injustice in the world today is overwhelming, and most of us live comfortable lives and are insulated from the horrors that are happening all over the world. The wars, the starvation, the murder. It all seems so far away. But as we'll ask in our affirmation of faith today, may we be called on beyond where we thought we could go. So what injustice do you see? What makes you say, that is not okay? Is there something you are called to do, no matter how small? Could you bring a can of food or a box of cereal to church each week to give to share? Or is there someone that you see repeatedly sitting outside your local grocery store asking for food? Could you maybe buy them a chocolate milk or a banana when you do your shopping? Or strike up a small conversation so they know they're not invisible? We can all do our small part to bring life and love to others who are struggling. We can all, as Jane says, be present with love, be resilient and hopeful, but be engaged and pray. Pray, pray, pray for the whole world because we all need God. Amen.